This is a game I've been working on for the better part of the year, and I would like to share some of what I've learned while making it. Welcome to Devlog 1 of Cloverskar, a Metroidvania platformer with bow and arrow combat. The way this project began is with the character. I knew that I wanted the player to use bow and arrow to fight and interact with the world, so I began by coming up with the controls of shooting arrows. The controls are actually fairly simple. Hold down the left mouse button to aim and release to shoot. This control scheme is actually fairly common in 3D games which utilize bow and arrow combat, but from what I found, platformers usually limit the aiming to 4 cardinal directions. Additionally, in many cases, arrows are shot by simply pressing a button. This approach does make sense since it makes it easier to shoot using a controller, but I really wanted to replicate that feeling of holding the bow charged and then releasing to shoot, since that's how it works in real life, so it makes you really feel like you're shooting from a bow. The rest of the controls are pretty typical for a platformer, so there's not a whole lot to talk about there, but since this is a Metroidvania, I wanted to create an upgrade system which expands the ways you can move around the world. For now, I made just one upgrade, Glide, which lets you hold down the jump button while in air to fall down slowly, but we'll talk more about that later. So here I am in my game, facing off against some ladybugs. Now they are passive enemies, so I don't have to worry about them hurting me unless I touch them, but I can use them to demonstrate some game feel mechanics. As you can see over here, I have some levers which I can use to turn on some game options. So as it is right now, the combat works just fine, but it's a little boring. Hold down the left mouse button to charge and release to shoot. The controls are simple enough, but how can we add some feedback to make the combat feel better? Well, first of all, let's turn on particles. Particles are an easy way to create some eye candy to enhance otherwise boring actions. As you can see, the enemies now explode on impact, and also the bow itself emits a little bit of particles whenever we shoot. Next we have camera shake, which has become a staple when talking about game feel. Every time we hit an enemy, the screen shakes just a little, but it's enough to make the shots feel much more impactful. Another way to add more weight to shooting an enemy is hit stop. Each time a shot lands, the game pauses for a fraction of a second. It's barely noticeable, but when playing it makes a giant difference. Next, aim animation. This is something I added to create more tension when charging the bow. As you're charging, the camera slowly moves in the direction in which you're aiming, and when you release the arrow, the camera quickly jerks back, releasing the tension. Finally, we have knockback. This is probably the most important addition in my opinion, because it's really easy to see just how much of a difference it makes to have enemies get pushed in the direction of the shot. It really makes the arrows seem more heavy, like they're actual objects hitting enemies instead of just a couple of colliders coming into contact. With all these 5 options combined, the combat has gone from boring mouse clicking to something that really feels alive. Even though I've been working on this game for a year, I still haven't really designed a world map. This I decided on purpose, because in some of my past projects, I made a mistake of rushing with level design. Sometimes when working on a demo or a prototype, it's tempting to try to create a big world as soon as possible to make the demo longer and to give the illusion of a big game early on. But I think this is a mistake because it makes it harder to later modify anything in the game, since with every change made to player movement or enemy AI, the levels would have to change as well. For example, if you increase the jump height of the player, he might be able to reach areas which were supposed to only be reached after gaining the double jump ability. My rule for this game was to implement all of the functionalities of a typical Metroidvania platformer before I go into the world design. So I designed a small starting area which would serve as a tutorial, and in here I could work on all the features of my game without worrying that I might break something in another part of the world. And only after I've implemented all of these features would I be allowed to start designing more levels. The way I do level design for this game is using Unity's tile map system. This was actually my first time using this package, and I have to say it really made my life easier. For those of you who don't know, the way this tile map system works is by using a sprite sheet of separate tiles which you can then paint into your level. You can choose to either draw the individual tiles by yourself, or you can create a set of rules to allow the system to automatically choose which tiles go where based on the tiles surrounding them. I decided to use a combination of these two. I created a set of rules for the ground and wall tiles because there's a lot of different combinations and it can be really time consuming to paint each one individually. But for the most of the background and decorations, I placed those individually since there's not a lot of them. Once I create a layout of the level that I'm happy with, it's time for decoration. First of all, I add some fog to create a bit of a magical atmosphere. This is just an image that I'm scrolling across the screen over the entire level. I can adjust the opacity and color of the image as well as the speed at which the fog moves. Next, I add some plants to make the scene feel more alive. I know it doesn't make too much sense that there are plants growing out of stone, but I guess it's possible. I also add some plants in the foreground to give the scene more depth. Next, I added a metal fence in the background, which again doesn't make too much sense, but I wanted to make the scene feel more gothic, and I thought a spiky fence would do the trick. On the walls in the back, I added some windows to make the scene feel more open. Also, I like the purple color of the sky, so I wanted it to be visible in the interior levels as well. Next, I wanted the scenery to feel a little bit more organic, because as it is, there's a lot of stone all around the scene, so I added some vines hanging from the ceiling. Also, I added some hanging grass both in the background and the foreground of the scene. And finally, the icing on the cake, lamps. Lights are always a sure way to add a lot of atmosphere and character to a level. In my case, I chose a bright orange color to contrast against the purple level.